Atlantic history. Atlantic history is a specialty field in history that studies the Atlantic world in the early modern period. The Atlantic world was created by the discovery of a new land by Europeans, and Atlantic history is the study of that world. It is premised on the idea that following the rise of sustained European contact with the New World in the 16th century, the continents that bordered the Atlantic Ocean, the Americas, Europe, and Africa constituted a regional system or common sphere of economic and cultural exchange that can be studied as a totality. Its theme is the complex interaction between Europe, especially Great Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal, and their colonies in the Americas. It encompasses a wide range of demographic, social, economic, political, legal, military, intellectual, and religious topics, treated in comparative fashion by looking at both sides of the Atlantic. Religious revivals in Britain and Germany are studies, as well as the First Great Awakening in the 13 Colonies. Emigration, race, and slavery are also important topics. Researchers of Atlantic history typically focus on the interconnections and exchanges between these regions and the civilizations they harbored. In particular, they argue that the boundaries between nation-states, which traditionally determined the limits of older historiography, should not be applied to such transnational phenomena as slavery, colonialism, missionary activity, and economic expansion. Environmental history and the study of historical demography also play an important role, as many key questions in the field revolve around the ecological and epidemiological impact of the Columbian exchange. Robert R. Palmer, an American historian of the French Revolution, pioneered the concept in the 1950s with a wide-ranging comparative history of how numerous nations experienced what he called the Age of the Democratic Revolution, a political history of Europe and America, 1760, 1800, 1959, and 1964. In this monumental work, he did not compare the French and the American revolutions as successful models against other types of revolutions. Indeed, he developed a wider understanding of the changes that were led by revolutionary processes across the Western civilization. Such work followed in the footsteps of C.L.R. James, who in the 1930s connected Caribbean with European history. Since the 1980s, Atlantic history has emerged as an increasingly popular alternative to the older discipline of imperial history, although it could be argued that the field is simply a refinement and reorientation of traditional historiography dealing with the interaction between early modern Europeans and native peoples in the Atlantic sphere. The organization of Atlantic history as a recognized area of historiography began in the 1980s under the impetus of American historians Bernard Bailyn of Harvard University and Jack P. Green of Johns Hopkins University, among others. The post-World War Roman II integration of the European Union and the continuing importance of NATO played an indirect role in stimulating interest throughout the 1990s. Development of the field. Bernard Bailyn's seminar on the history of the Atlantic world promoted social and demographic studies, and especially regarding demographic flows of population into colonial America. As a leading advocate of the history of the Atlantic world, Bailyn has organized an annual international seminar at Harvard designed. Professor Bailyn was the promoter of the International Seminar on the History of the Atlantic World, 1500-1825 at Harvard University. This was one of the first and most important academic initiatives to launch the Atlantic perspective. From 1995-2010, the Atlantic History Seminar sponsored an annual meeting of young historians engaged in creative research on aspects of Atlantic history. In all, 366 young historians came through the seminar program, 202 from universities in the U.S. and 164 from universities abroad. Its purpose was to advance the scholarship of young historians of many nations interested in the common, comparative, and interactive aspects of the lives of the peoples in the lands that are part of the Atlantic Basin, mainly in the early modern period, in order to contribute to the study of this transnational historical subject. Bailyn's Atlantic history Concepts and Contours 2005 explores the borders and contents of the emerging field, which emphasizes cosmopolitan and multicultural elements that have tended to be neglected or considered in isolation by traditional historiography dealing with the Americas. Phelan's reflections stem in part from his seminar at Harvard since the mid-1980s. Other important scholars are Jack Green, who directed a program at Johns Hopkins in Atlantic history from 1972 to 1992 that has now expanded to global concerns. Karen Ordwall Kupperman established the Atlantic Workshop at New York University in 1997. Other scholars in the field include Ida Altman, Kenneth J. Andrian, David Armitage, Trevor Bernard, George Canizarez-Esquerra, Nicholas Canny, Philip D. Curtin, Laurent Dubois, J. H. Elliott, David Elties, Allison Games, Iliga H. Good, Anthony Grafton, Joseph C. Miller, Philip. Perspectives. Allison Games 2006 explores the convergence of the multiple strands of scholarly interest that have generated the new field of Atlantic history, which takes as its geographic unit of analysis the Atlantic Ocean and the four continents that surround it. She argues Atlantic history is best approached as a slice of world history. The Atlantic, moreover, is a region that has logic as a unit of historical analysis only within a limited chronology. An Atlantic perspective can help historians understand changes within the region that a more limited geographic framework might obscure. Attempts to write a Broadelian Atlantic history, one that includes and connects the entire region, remain elusive, driven in part by methodological impediments, by the real disjunction that characterized the Atlantic's historical and geographic components, by the disciplinary divisions that discourage historians from speaking to and writing for each other, and by colonial studies. One impetus for Atlantic studies began in the 1960s with the historians of slavery, who started tracking the routes of the transatlantic slave trade. A second source came from historians who studied the colonial history of the United States. Many were trained in early modern European history and were familiar with the historiography of the British Empire, which had been introduced a century before by George Louis Beer and Charles MacLean Andrews. Historians studying colonialism have long been open to interdisciplinary perspectives, such as comparative approaches. In addition, there was a frustration involved in writing about very few people in a small remote colony. Atlantic history opens the horizon to large forces at work over great distances. Criticism. Some critics have complained that Atlantic history is little more than imperial history under another name. It has been argued that it is too expansive in claiming to subsume both of the American continents, Africa and Europe, without seriously engaging with them. According to Caroline Dodds-Pennock, indigenous people are often seen as static recipients of transatlantic encounter, despite the fact that thousands of Native Americans crossed the ocean during the 16th century, some by choice. Canadian scholar Ian K. Steele argued that Atlantic history will tend to draw students interested in exploring their country's history and beyond national myths, while offering historical support for such 21st century policies as the North American Free Trade Agreement NAFTA, the Organization of American States OAS, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. He concludes, the early modern Atlantic can even be read as a natural antechamber for American-led globalization of capitalism and serve as an historical challenge to the coalescing New Europe.